Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alicia. Today we're going to be going over the books that I read in April, so without any further ado, let's get right into the books. So as always, we'll start off with the stats, and then after that we'll go ahead and get into the books. This month I'm kind of feeling like starting with the books that weren't for me and then working my way up to the best book that I read in the month of April instead of dividing it by genre. So you can go ahead and look at the timestamps down below. I'll put timestamps for the books that weren't for me, the good books, the great books, and then the fantastic books that I read in April. So let's start off with the stats. In the month of April, I read a total of 11 books. Out of those 11 books, 10 of them were fiction, and I did read one nonfiction. In terms of format that I read them, I did read 2 physical books, I read 1 ebook, and I listened to 7 of them on audio. That is amazing because last year I rarely listened to audiobooks, and you know what? Audiobooks are game changers. I can listen to audiobooks as I go on my walks, as I clean around the house, as I play with my dogs. It's great. Highly recommend. So in terms of genre breakdown, I did read 3 thrillers, I read 4 fantasy, 1 classic, 1 sci-fi, and the nonfiction book that I did read was a memoir. No. So my little dog is right here with me, and I swear she only likes to chew on her loud ass bone when I'm filming. Every other time she's like, nah, I'll just lay here, I'll just take a nap. Then all of a sudden I'm filming and she's like, all right, let me chew on my bone. And now she's doing a cute little face. No. Okay, so let's start off with my misses for the month. There are 2 books in this category. The first one of those is Sadie by Courtney Summers, and I know this is an unpopular opinion because everybody and their mother loves Sadie by Courtney Summers, and you know what, it just wasn't for me, and that's totally fine. We all have different reading tastes and we appreciate different things from stories. So what is this book about? Sadie is classified as a thriller, but I actually would say it's more of a contemporary mystery novel. Just putting it out there, I didn't think it was thrilling. I don't think it was a thriller. It's more along the lines of a mystery. And that is partly why this is a miss for me. There are certain things that I really like in my mysteries, and this one just didn't do it for me. So Sadie is told from a dual point of view. In the first point of view, we're following Sadie. Sadie grew up with her sister Maddie, and because of their home dynamics and life circumstances, Sadie, who is the older of the two, ended up oftentimes taking care of her little sister, especially when their mom abandoned them. And one day Maddie is killed, and the police have no leads on who Maddie's murderer is. Sadie thinks that she knows who the killer is, and she goes on this revenge adventure to try to find the killer and confront them. So in our dual timeline, we follow a radio personality who was doing a segment on forgotten towns. He learns that Sadie's been missing, and he gets really interested and involved in Sadie's story. He wants to find out what happened to her and where she is before it's too late. And so we do alternate between these 2 timelines. Now, doesn't that sound fantastic? Yeah, but unfortunately it just didn't work out for me. I did listen to this in audiobook format though, and I do have to say that the audiobook is chef's kiss. The audiobook is a full production. During the podcast sections, it actually sounds like a podcast. So if you are at all interested in this book, I recommend going the audiobook route because that is what made me finish the story. If I wasn't listening to it on audiobook, I probably wouldn't have finished it, if I'm being honest. So like I mentioned before, this book didn't really work out for me, and it's primarily because of the mystery element of it. We know that Maddie's been killed, and we know that Sadie wants revenge, but I feel like we never really get into Sadie's head and into her motivations. Obviously her motivation is her sister's been killed and she wants revenge, but we don't really know from the beginning where she's getting this information from. We just know that she's purchasing this car and she's going off and going after someone, and throughout the story we do get more development, but I feel like for the most part the author was holding out key pieces of information, that way you're forced to continue reading. And in mysteries, I like being given information. I want to try to solve the mystery, and I feel like without those key pieces of information I wasn't able to. As bad as it sounds, I didn't want to go on this road trip with Sadie, and I didn't want to go on this journey with this radio personality who wasn't even getting good information until the end because her family members were holding out. I wanted to be given information, and I wanted to try to solve this along with them, and that's just not how this felt. It just felt like we were getting told a very sad story, and it was heartbreaking at times, yes, but unfortunately the mystery element was the element that didn't work for me here. So what can I say? The next book on this list that didn't work for me is Upright Women Wanted, and this is by Sarah Gailey. This was one that was a little bit of a disappointment for me because I did think that I was going to like it. It's a queer dystopian western, and you know what, I should have known from the beginning that it wasn't going to be for me because it's a western and I don't like those settings, and on top of that I listened to it on audiobook. So I couldn't. The western aspect of it just didn't work for me, and I wish it would have, but it just didn't. But I thought, hey, it's a novella, it's pretty short, it's this dystopian sci-fi read. let's just go ahead and do it. But no, it didn't work for me. So what is this book about? So in Upright Women Wanted, we follow our main character named Esther, who runs away after her best friend has been killed. And this is set in a near future United States where we've kind of been reverted back to like Western times, very sort of like The Handmaid's Tale, where a lot of liberties are taken away from women and it's kind of fascist in a way. We do have a group who are called the librarians who go ahead and travel throughout the United States delivering approved reading materials from the state. And so when Esther runs away, she hides in one of these caravans because she wants to be proper, you know, she wants to be upright. And this is what she thinks these librarians represent. Esther is someone who is struggling with their identity and with her self-worth because of these times that are telling her that being in intimate relationships with other women is a sin. And so she's really struggling with that. And she runs away from home because she is being forced to marry a man that she doesn't love and doesn't want to be with. And this is where our story takes off as Esther starts to realize that there's a lot more to the librarians than just delivering approved materials. I do want to point out some stuff that I thought was done really well in this book, even though it wasn't for me because of the Western aspect. So I really felt like this story really fit within the structure of a novella. Sometimes when I read novellas, I feel like I wanted a little bit more. I feel like it takes a quite outstanding author or just someone who knows how to write novellas to really write a story in that format, to be able to capture the world, the characters, to have an intriguing story and a complete arc. And I feel like that was delivered here. I didn't feel like there was anything missing. I felt like the story was completed. I really did feel like we had nuanced and well-written characters, and I can picture the world. I also felt like it was really powerful to follow the story of a girl who is trying to find her self-worth in a society that is telling her that the way that she is wrong. I love that she was able to grow into herself and be unapologetically herself. I just felt like this book was really powerful in that aspect. So if you're not thrown off by the Western side of this book, maybe it's one that you should try out. If the rest of the book sounds like something you should try out, it just wasn't for me. Okay, so now we're getting into the books that I thought were good. These were books that I thoroughly enjoyed. There was just some aspects to them that I just couldn't stand behind, or maybe the ending disappointed me, but overall I thought they were good, solid books. The first one of those is The Patient by Jasper DeWitt, and this is one where I was really liking, and it has one of my favorite tropes in thrillers, but the ending just, I just couldn't with the ending. And I know some people would consider me talking about the ending, even just mentioning the trope that was used for the ending, to be a spoiler. So if you've read this book, I didn't like the ending, and it was because of the twist. So what is The Patient about? So The Patient is told as a series of online posts by a psychiatrist named Dr. Parker, who works in a mental hospital in the New England area. In these posts, Dr. Parker is slowly revealing all of these events that happened while he worked there. There's one particular patient that he became really intrigued about. This patient had been with the institution since they were 6 and now they're 40, and there's a bunch of red tape around this patient. Only certain people are allowed to talk to him, and he's separated from all of the other patients. And in his medical charts, it's been documented that he makes people go mad. So Dr. Parker is really intrigued, and he really wants to solve the mystery behind this patient. He thinks that he might be the person that can finally cure this patient. And so he does become this patient's psychiatrist, and on this online forum, he lets us know how the events unraveled as he saw them. And it was a fast read. I was thoroughly engaged. I read it in one day. As soon as I picked it up, I was like, ooh, this is going to be good. And it was great. I love the story. But you know what? The ending killed it for me. And because of that, I just think that it's good. So for those of you who don't like spoilers, I will leave a timestamp down below. I'm just gonna let other people know why I didn't like this end. I won't give specific details of how the book ended. I'll just say the trope that was used. So if you don't want spoilers at all whatsoever, skip to the part without spoilers. Okay, 3, 2, 1. So I didn't like that this was a paranormal ending, and I usually do not like paranormal endings in my thrillers. I personally feel like they're cop-outs. I prefer something that doesn't require me to suspend my disbelief. I prefer something along the lines that is unsolvable to people who don't follow all of the details. Like, I still want it to be something realistic and believable, not just a paranormal plot twist. And because of that, it's only good. Okay, end of spoilers. The next book in this category of good books that I read is A Dead Djinn in Cairo, and this is by P. Djali Clark. York, and this is a fantasy novella with mystery elements. As you can tell, I've really been vibing with mysteries. It felt really refreshing to read a mystery in a fantasy setting because I have been into mysteries a lot lately. This book is set in 1912 in an alternative Cairo, and we have a ministry called the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities, and they're responsible for investigating disturbances between mortals and the divine. In comes our investigator called Fatma, and she is investigating a weird suicide. She found a jinn who had committed suicide, which is really rare. They usually don't do that. She doesn't think that this is a suicide. She thinks there is something nefarious, something else at work here, and so she follows her instinct, and the possibility of a larger scheme arises. So this was a fun and fast read. This is the first novella of a series, I believe. There is another novella, and then there's a full-length novel. So I will be continuing because I'm intrigued. I thought there was enough world building in this to make the mystery work. I also liked that the full arc was completed and we weren't left wondering any details, but we got a glimpse and a taste of this larger world, and I am intrigued, so I will be continuing. The next book in this category of good books is Upon a Burning Throne, and this is by Ashok K. Banker. This is another one that I had really high hopes for, and even though I had an immense amount of fun reading it, there was just a lot of things that left me a little bit disillusioned and or confused, and because of that I just thought it was a good solid read. I still will be continuing on, it's just not going to be a priority read for me. So Upon a Burning Throne is a plot-driven, multiple POV, Indian-inspired epic fantasy. Doesn't that sound fantastic? And like I said, it was a good time reading it. This tale was inspired by the Mahabharata. Now, as a reviewer, I cannot speak to the accuracy of Upon a Burning Throne and how well it reflects on the Mahabharata, so if I find a Known Voices review, I will go ahead and link it down below, but unfortunately, I just can't let you know if it was very accurate. But if you do know, let me know down below because I'm super interested in that, and I know other people will be interested in that, so let us know down below. So what is a Burning Throne about? After the emperor of this massive burnt empire dies, we need to find a new ruler. We have two heirs who must undergo this test of fire and magic. They need to sit upon the burning throne and survive in order to be declared the ruler. Those who don't pass this test are automatically incinerated and engulfed by the flames. So we have two princes, Shvate and Ari, and they each have disabilities. Ari is born blind and Shvate is born albino, and because of this, the larger society in this world seems to think of them as unworthy. They prove their kingdom wrong when they both sit on the throne and are deemed worthy by it. However, plot twist, there is a third heir who is also crushed in, and her father wants her to be put to the test, which she is, and when she survives as the oldest, she is denied the claim to the burnt empire. As a result, her father Jarson declares that he will destroy the burnt empire, and from there we go on this massive adventure of gods and demigods and mortals. Like I mentioned, it was a lot of fun to read. One thing that I particularly liked about A Burning Throne is that we have horror elements, so do be warned if you don't like horror, because you do have elements of it sprinkled throughout, which I think just added this extra layer of richness. So now let's talk about the things that I didn't quite enjoy and why I only thought it was good. Right off the bat, one of them was the writing style. It does have a lot of purple prose, and that's not usually something that detracts from my reading experience, but I do have to say that it took me a while to get used to it, especially when the epilogue to this book was so long. It just felt like it was never ending, and the writing just didn't help get me engaged right off the bat. It was a hurdle that I had to overcome. Once I was used to it, it was easy peasy, no breeze, but it's just something that I didn't want to point out. The other thing that I want to mention is that there were a lot of random time jumps. Now, I'm someone that loves when authors play with time and when we have time jumps. One of the best books that I read this month actually does that, and I loved it in that book. But in this one, there were so many time jumps, and sometimes we skip decades without any real explanation. And as a reader, you never really get filled in to what happened in that extensive time. In this case, it just felt like so many years were skipped without any real rising action. And because of that, I felt like it was a plot device to further the story rather than intentional time jumps that helped further the story. The next thing that I personally didn't like in the book, I am a character-driven reader, and the majority of this book is plot-driven. Because I am a character-driven reader, I felt like the plot meandered so much. A lot of the story, we're following these characters traveling all over the burnt empire and doing things here and doing things there, and I just didn't really see a means to an end. end. I didn't really see why we were going in all of these different directions. I just felt like there was no purpose behind the meandering, and because of that I really didn't get attached to the characters, and I didn't really feel invested in the end of the story. Which brings me to my last point. This in the synopsis is set up as these 3 heirs fighting for the throne, and that's not really what is delivered in the overall story. Our last heir, Kushida, she comes up in the introduction and is never heard from again. Now, I did hear that the sequel to Upon a Burning Throne centers around her and her mother, but then why is she mentioned in the synopsis of this book? So I don't know. So those were just minor things that I had trouble with, but I think I had enough fun that I will continue. Like I mentioned, it's just not a priority. Okay, now we're getting to the exciting part. So this next section is going to be 4 books that I thought were great. The first one of those is 8 Perfect Murders, and this is going to be by Peter Swanson. This is my first Peter Swanson book, but I really liked it. And this would have been in the fantastic category if there weren't for one thing, and it's that it spoils the plot for 8 other books. And I'll tell you why. So in this one, we follow a bookseller who finds himself in the middle of an FBI investigation. Earlier in his life, he had written a blog post about the 8 perfect murders in fiction. Now, these murders were ones that were practically unsolvable, murders that people could actually get away with in real life. Fast forward to the present, someone is committing those murders that he wrote about, and he is tangentially tied to some of these victims. Coincidence? Who knows? I think not. So an FBI agent shows up at his doorstep and asks for his help in order to find out who is committing these crimes. And it was such a fun read. Similarly to The Patient, I was engaged the entire time. I had so much fun reading it, and I love that there was this mystery aspect to it again. I was really invested in finding out who the killer was. And you know what, mind you, I read in some reviews that it was really blatant who the person was, but I didn't know. I didn't know right up until the end. So like I said, I had a good time. The only downside to this book that I found is that because those 8 murders are based on fictional books, it spoils them. It lets you know how those books end. Namely, the ABC Murders by Agatha Christie. You also have, what's that book called by Donna Tartt? The one about a secret society or something like that. I forgot the name of that book because I haven't read it. But it spoils so many books that I wanted to read. So that's the only reason it's not fantastic, because it doesn't warn you at the beginning that it's going to spoil all of these books. So if you don't want those books spoiled, go ahead and read them before picking up 8 Perfect Murders. The next book in the category of great books that I read in April is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This was another one that could have been in the fantastic category, but there were some minor issues that I had with it. So I'm one of those people who didn't have this in high school as a required reading, and because of that I didn't feel like reading it. But my partner Ben was like, hey, I really liked The Great Gatsby, you should check it out. And I tried reading it last year. I got 20 pages in and then I forgot about it, never picked it up because I really wasn't interested in the story. It comes off at first a little bit dry, and at the time it felt like, oh, rich people problems, you know? But I read it, and I sat with my feelings for a couple of weeks, and you know what? I think it's a great book. And for a book that was written in the 1920s, 1930s, I think it still holds up. That's just me. So what is The Great Gatsby about? So The Great Gatsby centers on a group of wealthy individuals living in New England in the roaring 20s. We have a fellow named Gatsby who comes from new money and he likes to show it off. He lives in this giant mansion and he throws these lavish and opulent parties all of the time. And he just so happens to live, coincidentally, across the bay from his long lost love, Daisy Buchanan. So of course, as many love story goes, although I don't really know if this is a love story or not. No, it's not a love story. But anyway, so as many potential love stories and most infatuations go, Daisy is married to this giant asshole who takes her for granted. Not that she's much of a great person in the first place, because she's not. So, some external conflict is thrown in there. But Gatsby has hope. And from there, a tragic story unfolds. So first of all, the story isn't told from Gatsby's perspective. It's actually told from Daisy's cousin's perspective, who lives next door to Gatsby, and he gets involved in between their relationship, trying to set up time for Daisy and Gatsby to spend quality time together. But anyways, let's talk about the things that I really liked about this book. I just feel like there's just something undeniably American about this book. Not in a good way, Let me start by that. We have these themes going on where people confuse money for having merit when that's not always the case. We also have this discussion on people confusing happiness for having expensive material possessions, and that's not always the case. So I feel like there's just a lot of great discussions and themes. I also really like this juxtaposition of old money versus new money, and how those with old money tend to look down on people with new money. Like I said when I first picked up this book, you know, rich people with rich people problems, but I actually think this book brings up a really good discussion around money and wealth and how it's accumulated and how it stays in the hands of a certain few. The second thing that I really liked about this book is it sort of feels like a time capsule. I feel like it really captures the essence of a generation, of the roaring 20s, of opulence and greed and rampant gluttony that happened after World War II. Not that there weren't great things that happened in the 20s, but I just feel like it captures that decadence of that decade before the Great Depression happened, because then anyways, so there were minor things that I actually didn't like about the book. One is that there was a small amount, not significant, but nonetheless a small amount of racism, especially in, what's his name? Tom's character, Daisy's husband. He's just an asshole and a racist, and I didn't like him. Just a lot of the characters in this book I don't like in general, but I like the story, even though all of the characters are unlikable in my opinion. The other thing is that there was also this sort of negative framing of female characters. The three women that are the center of this book were framed as bitchy, materialistic, and vapid. And yes, for the most part, they were rich white women, so that's not representative of all the women in this era, but it's just that they were the focus of the story and that's how they were framed. And you can argue that that was part of their characterization to really fit the themes of this book, but nonetheless, that is something that I did notice. So because of that, I just thought it was a great book, and the longer that I sit and think about it, the more that I like it, and I like the discussions that it brought up. The last book in this category of great books is going to be The Empress of Salt and Fortune, and this is by Mi Vo. This is a slow-paced, character-driven fantasy novella, and I really quite enjoyed it. I was captivated, I was spellbound, and it felt very intimate. I really loved the progression of the plot in the format that it was told, through the character that it was told. It was just very captivating for me. So what is this book about? This is the first book in the Singing Hills cycle. I believe this is going to be a duology if I'm not mistaken, but I am not quite sure, so let me know if I'm wrong. And this is a very short book. It's approximately 112 pages. It was like about 2 hours long in audiobook format. And even though this book was so short, the characters and the plot and the world felt extremely rich. Like, I felt like the cultures and the history and the politics of this world were fully developed. I felt like I was there. And you know, in part, I think that has to do because of the excellent writing. This is actually told as a series of memories, and it's strange because I would think that because it's told in a series of memories, I wouldn't really feel present in the book, but it had the complete opposite effect. Like, I felt like I was there, remembering with this person and reminiscing. But because it's told in this method, it also felt very intimate and very personal, yet also disconnected. Weird juxtaposition there. So in this book, we're following a cleric who is traveling, searching for information on some past historical events. And so this cleric ends up meeting Rabbit, and it's actually told in two parts. In the first part, we get the interactions between the cleric and Rabbit. The second part is told as a series of memories from Rabbit's perspective. Rabbit recounts their time as a servant girl to Empress Inyo during her ascendancy. And during this time, Empress Inyo was married off for political alliance in order to have peace between these neighboring kingdoms. Once she is married for peace, and once she delivers the baby that she's supposed to have, she is sort of exiled. And so Rabbit recounts the tale of Empress Inyo arriving and how Rabbit ended up being a servant girl for them. So at the beginning of each chapter, we actually get descriptions of different items throughout Rabbit's house as the cleric is walking around Rabbit's house. And it's through these items that the story is told, as Rabbit recounts memories of the time being under Empress Inyo's guardianship, I guess. So again, this is extremely character driven. It's also very slow and intimate. If you're someone who loves plot driven books and likes a lot of action, this is not going to be the book for you because it's extremely slow and extremely character driven. Overall, I just loved how rich the story felt in such a short amount of time, and I really loved the way that the story was told. I thought it was a great book. My camera died, oops, so I'm refilming this part. But I have 2 more books left to talk about, and these both fall under the fantastic books that I read in April. These were the 2 best books that I read in April, and I really, really enjoyed them. The first one of those is Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. I am a convert. I had been staying away from Riley Sager books for quite a while, even though I really enjoyed thrillers. It's easily becoming one of my favorite genres. I've been falling into this trap where I read overhyped books and I ended up not liking them, like The Midnight Library, Anxious People. I haven't really been liking the really overhyped books, so I've been staying away from Riley Sager because I know people love Riley Sager and they love the books, so I didn't want to be the person with unpopular opinions. But I am here to tell you that I read Home Before Dark and I loved it. 5-star read for me, really enjoyed it. It didn't fall into that trapping that The Patient did in with the ending, those types of endings that I don't like. It wasn't like that. So I'm so glad that I enjoyed the book every step through and also enjoyed the end. And there were no major spoilers for other books. I'm just saying, that's all I ask for. So in case you haven't read Home Before Dark, this is a thriller told in 2 separate points of views. I did listen to this in audiobook format, and in the book we follow our main character Maggie, who has recently inherited Bainbury Hall, which is the house that her and her parents lived with when she was a child. They lived there for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, can't really remember the amount of time they lived there, but they were, according to her dad, pushed out of the house because there were supernatural things going on there that put their lives at risk. So, like I mentioned earlier, this is told from dual perspective. We do follow Maggie in the present when she inherits Bainbury Hall, and she goes back as she is drawn to this house. She goes back with a pretense of, wanting to remodel it and put it up for sale, but really she's drawn to the house, and she wants to find out if all of the things said about her childhood are true. The second point of view is actually told in a form of chapters taken from the best-selling horror memoir that Maggie's dad wrote after leaving Bainbury Hall. These 2 points of view slowly start to come together as the book starts to unravel. Really, 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 really enjoyed this book. I generally just really enjoy books that are told from different points of views, especially when they're done very seamlessly and very organically. Unfortunately, Sadie wasn't one of those. I felt like in this one, the 2 timelines really played off of each other and really built a lot of tension and suspense that really propelled the plot forward and kept me engaged as a reader. As soon as I started reading it, I didn't want to put it down. I can't remember if I finished it in a day or 2, but I just plowed through it because I was super engaged and I wanted to know what happened. I actually really liked Maggie as our main character. She was someone that was strong, confident, and bold. She really wanted to find out the truth regardless of what that meant for her. There were some parts where she could be like a tad bit annoying, but if she felt like a real character, and humans have faults, and so did she, and so yeah, she was annoying in some parts of it, but I even enjoyed those parts because she felt like a realistic character. I also really loved the way that this book came together. I love that there was breadcrumbs scattered everywhere so you could potentially figure out what happened at the end, but they don't tell you outright. You do have to do a little bit critical thinking, but it's not so far out there that it's just not believable or you have to suspend your disbelief. So very, 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 very strong novel for me. I don't know if I gave it a 4.5 or a 5 out of 5, but definitely one of the best books that I read in April, and because of this, I'm going to go ahead and read more Riley Sager. So the last book on this list, as you can tell, is my nonfiction read, which was the memoir, and this is going to be The Magical Language of Others by E.J. Koh. This was a beautifully written, raw book that at times was difficult to get through because it doesn't shy away from heavy topics. It lets you sit in them and take them in. It's, again, very raw, very emotional, can lean on the heavy. If you want to pick it up, I recommend looking up the trigger warnings for it because it does have quite a few of them. So this is a memoir, and this gives you a very intimate look into Ko's relationship with her family, but specifically Ko's relationship with her mom. As she was growing up, her brother and herself were left in the United States for them to study here and grow up, while her parents moved back to Korea in order to provide a better life. Her father was presented with a very enticing package from a company and they just couldn't put it down, so they left left, leaving her and her brother to fend for themselves here in the United States. A lot of this book is her recounting her struggles and her growing up and coming of age here without a mother, but we also do get her mother's perspective through a series of letters that she translates when she's a lot older. And as she's translating these letters, we get glimpses into different points in time of her past, but also into different historical events that happen in Japan and in Korea, which I thought was really wonderfully done. And I also love that I got to learn about historical events that are unfamiliar to me. Earlier in the video, I alluded to time jumps and how I really love them in books, but only when they're done well. I don't usually see them done in memoirs. That's an unconventional plot device that's often not used in memoir, but it is very cleverly done here because these letters serve as time jumps to explore other aspects and times of her life. It was just fantastic. It flowed very seamlessly. And overall, this use I felt like was very impactful because it really felt like we saw her grow, but we saw her go through all the messy parts of her life. And growing and coming into age is not something that's linear. It's something that's very messy. Sometimes we move one step forward and move 10 steps back, and I just feel like the trajectory that we follow in the book, it just added this extra layer of intimacy to the book that I didn't quite expect. I also thought that the writing was exceptional and beautiful. Ko is herself a poet, and you can definitely tell. So if you love memoirs, this is one that I highly recommend you pick up. And if you're participating in the Asian Readathon for the month of May, hey, this is an Asian author, and this could be your pick for the nonfiction section. Just saying. So those were all the books that I read in the month of April. If you like my content, go ahead and like and subscribe. That is the best way that you can support me. Don't forget to water your plants and feed your pets. I'll see you on the next one. Bye!